Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful Sunday afternoon. So we want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for attention to this very important topic. And most importantly, thank you for your concern for our young people and the education of our future. The time is currently 3 o'clock. My name is Jonathan Madison. I am the Vice President of the Board of Directors for the Alpha Community Education Initiative. And this is EdEQ, which is an advocacy webinar / training for educational advocacy around equity in K through 12. And so I would like to turn this over to Dondrell Swanson, who is the President of the Board of Directors for ACEI, for a few opening comments and a welcome. Dondrell, you're muted. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Madison, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone that is out there right now. Just wanted to welcome you to this workshop. We are excited to bring it to you, but we're more excited to offer our congratulations to each of you that came here today, hoping to plan and engage on advocacy. There are a lot of things that you're going to hear about today going on in our schools, and we want to make sure that we take the opportunity to empower and equip every one of you to play a critical role in making sure that we provide an equitable format of education for everyone. So thank you. Please feel free to visit us at educatingourfuture.org to gather more information about ACEI, as well as Dr. Wood and his initiative and opportunities to connect with them. And you'll hear more about that a little bit later. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Thank you, President Swanson. So we have a lot we'd like to share. And as I said, my name is John Madison. So I will be your moderator and host for this evening as we get into some pretty important topics, but we also feel we will provide not just a setting and some details to provide some elevation to your understanding on the scenario as it relates to education of our young people in K through 12, but more broadly, we believe this information should yield a call to action. And we will provide not only the case or the challenge, but before this afternoon is over, we will also provide suggestions and some tangible ways that each of you can begin playing a role in being an advocate, as well as a champion for change as it relates to educating our young people. Before we get into the meat of this afternoon, I would like to recognize the other members of the Board of Directors for the Alpha Community Education Initiative. So Rich Smith, would you maybe raise your hand? We see you. Good to see you here. King Gonzalez, good to see you. Jamie Pender, can you wave? Brother Jason Dorsett, would you wave? Sammy Scales, would you wave? Outstanding, outstanding. And I also want to acknowledge our phenomenal, talented, and tremendously multitask-oriented interpreters who'll be providing American Sign Language for the duration of this afternoon. Taylor Smith, who's visible, you can see her currently, as well as Denise Trimble Smith, she will be switching with, so each of our interpreters can have a break as we go through this afternoon. Before I introduce our key speaker for this afternoon, I also would like to highlight a couple of individuals who will be providing some of those tangibles that we mentioned a little earlier in the latter portion of this afternoon and this session. And so we will provide some ways and some templates and even some specific practices that you can engage in to be an advocate and an agent of change as it relates to engaging with your local school boards. Dr. Akbar, would you maybe even say hello or wave so that people can hear your voice?
Yes, hello, how you doing? And I'm looking forward to a great session.
Outstanding. So Dr. Akbar actually serves as the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Kent State University, and he also happens to be a president of a school board in the Akron, Ohio area. Another gentleman, Mr. Ronald Rice. Ron, would you wave and maybe tell the people hello?
Good afternoon, family. Good to be here today.
Outstanding. We're so glad to have you. Ron Rice is currently the Senior Director for Government Relations with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools in Washington, D.C. And he has over 25 years of public policy experience in the fields of education, urban development, community empowerment, and as well as serving as the executive state government appointee for 2 terms for local elected officials. So really happy to have you with us. So Ron is going to be leading a discussion around engaging with local legislators in your area. I also would like to acknowledge myself, John Madison. I'm actually the immediate past executive director of the Western region of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I also serve as the vice president of the board of directors for ACEI. And in my day job, I am actually a research scientist, and I'll be providing some tangible actions as well as resources on engaging in social media so that we can amplify the message and make sure the word gets out to motivate others to also take action. And last but not least, I certainly want to acknowledge and provide a small introduction to some and a presentation to others of Dr. J. Luke Wood, who is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity, and he's the Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. He also serves as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. He is a national researcher, and he also is really one of the foremost experts in this space on educational equity, particularly as it relates to Black minds. And so we are so happy to have some of Dr. Luke Wood's time, and we're also happy to be able to partner with Black Minds Matter to bring this program and this information to you all. And so I don't take any more of his time. I want to just go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Wood, who's going to walk us through a lot of not just the psychology, but a lot of the data around what we see in terms of education, in terms of disparity as it relates to African Americans and other students of color. So with that, Dr. Wood, I'd like to pass it on to you. And I would like to remind everyone that we are in a webinar. So if you do have questions, we certainly want to get to them. And so we would ask you to do one of 2 things: either place them in the chat, and then myself or another member of the board of directors will funnel those either to Dr. Wood or he'll engage them directly. And we also would like to mention that we will have at least a 15-minute approximate Q&A after the presentation to also get some additional questions in. So we certainly want to drive engagement, and we certainly want to be available to answer your questions and not just ask them, but get them answered. And so please put them in the chat and we'll work them in the conversation so we can move speedily through the content, but also give you all a chance to engage meaningfully. So with that, Dr. Wood, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I appreciate the warm introduction and the ability to be able to be here today and to have this important conversation. And so I'm glad that this day has come and that we're able to engage in the conversation. And Jonathan, I want to thank you for the introduction and your willingness to serve as the lead for today's in terms of the Masters of Ceremony. So this day today is a collaboration with ACEI, as was mentioned, and Black Minds. And essentially it is a call to action for us to focus on what we can better do to support our Black students in education. And so, as was mentioned, here are a number of speakers that are going to be part of today's convening, myself in terms of providing some of the framing comments, and then the breakout sessions in which will be led by these respective gentlemen here that you see on your screen. And so looking forward to jumping into this conversation. So many of you who have heard me present before know that I love to start any presentation focused on Black students with this quote here from Asa Hilliard, who was an educational scholar, an Africana Studies scholar, a psychologist, really just a sage across multiple fields. And one of the things that Asa said is that after years and years of doing research focused on Black students, he said, I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. But we know when it comes to our Black students that love is not always equally distributed as it should be. And so that's unfortunately one of the reasons why we need to be here for this conversation today. And what you're going to see today are some data from the parents of Black children talking about the experiences of Black students, both before and during the pandemic. And so we have recent data that we'll be sharing that helps to paint a picture about how the pandemic has led to really inverse impacts for many of our minoritized communities, but certainly has affected our Black students as well. And so we're talking about what that looks like. Often when people see data like the data that I'll be presenting, the response is to immediately go to what's comfortable, which is to blame students, blame their families, and blame their communities. And to say, for example, what the heck is wrong with these kids? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? So a focus on blaming the students, or we oftentimes see a focus on blaming parents and saying, why aren't they engaged? Why don't they care? When interestingly, what research has shown is that Black parents are actually more engaged, and actually Black fathers even more engaged than all different father groups. However, that is not data that is oftentimes presented when in fact that is what the reality is. But what we do find is that the types of engagement can look different in terms of Black parents being more engaged in the classroom, where you find maybe white parents being and non-Black parents being more engaged in other areas. And so it really goes to a school's value system as to what type of engagement that they value. So one of the things that we also think is important is to shift away from these kinds of narratives, again, that blame students, and to really focus on ourselves and say, well, what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in our Black children not doing as well as they should? Recognizing that it's not a breakdown in the students, but it's a breakdown in the systems that serve them. And unfortunately, it's a breakdown not just in one area, but across multiple different areas, right? We know that Black children face an underrepresentation in gifted and talented education programs, but are overrepresented in misplaced into special education programs, particularly as emotionally behaviorally disturbed. And you can look to the works of scholars such as Jawanza Kunjufu, Donna Ford, Fred Bonner to see how these patterns play out. The second thing that we know is that they're overrepresented when it comes to what's called exclusionary discipline. Now, this is when you take a student who's in a learning environment and you remove them from that learning environment for a temporary or permanent period of time. That can be loss of recess, but it can also be suspension from school, in-home suspension, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, or even an expulsion. And we know that those first two patterns, overrepresentation in special education and overexposure to exclusionary discipline, those two patterns serve as the pillars to the school to prison pipeline. We also know there's an underrepresentation of teachers who look like the students and the communities that they come from. And we know that that creates a number of different dynamics that can lead to oppositional relationships between students and the educators who are there to serve them. And what I would also like to point out is going down to the very bottom, the school-based trauma. Now, it's interesting because we have framed this conversation as being in the midst of the two pandemics, which it is, right? We are in the midst of COVID-19, which has borne disproportionate infections, unemployment, and loss of life in minoritized communities, but particularly in the Black community. And so as a result, students who would have normally been able to be by the bedside of a loved one as they transition from this life to the next haven't been able to do that. Students who've been able to, in past, go to a funeral or to a wake and be in community with family members as they mourn the loss of a loved one haven't been able to do that. And of course, we've talked about the pandemic of anti-Blackness, which is a global phenomenon, but has a unique strain here in the United States that we've seen through the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others. And so ultimately, what it comes down to is recognizing that when we talk about trauma, we have to recognize that trauma has been the routinized experience of many of our students before the pandemic, but certainly has been elevated during the pandemic. And what makes that particularly sad is that ultimately many educators will point to that trauma and say, look at what's happening in society. Look what's happening in policing. Look what is happening out there, without recognizing that trauma happens in schools, colleges, and universities as well. And the ways that we engage our students either serve to create an environment of support or one that only serves to reify the experiences that they've had in wider society. Now, if you've been part of any of the programming for Black Minds, you've heard us talk a lot about microaggressions. And essentially, it's a term that was coined by Chester Pierce, who was a psychologist at Harvard University, and really since expanded out by scholars such as Daryl Wing Su, Daniel Solorzano, William Smith from the University of Utah, and many others. And so ultimately what it comes down to is that there's subtle forms of racism, microaggressions, that are communicated to our students And those messages, while subtle, have a damaging impact on them long-term because they serve to accumulate over time. And as you can see on your screen, racial microaggressions are defined as brief and commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. Whether intentional or unintentional, they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. And so one of the most common examples of this that many of you will be familiar with is saying to a person of color, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate." That's said to us with a sense of surprise, which really communicates the underlying message, which is, "I didn't think that you would be." And so ultimately, when it comes to these messages, sometimes they're very clear in terms of what's being communicated, like a message of criminality can be sometimes very clear, but sometimes they're veiled in ways that make them hard to discern. For example, the one I said before, like, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate." What's really being communicated is, "I didn't expect that you would be." Or asking a Black student for their ID when they're on campus, right, is what is said, but what is really said is, "I think that you might be here to steal something, so I want to make sure that you're supposed to be here." And so what's really said is on your screen, that you're different from us, you don't belong here, you're not intelligent and capable, you're a criminal. And these are messages that our students are receiving on a daily basis, and it's only been heightened during COVID-19. And ultimately, we've talked about this being really filtered through three primary lenses, which are called distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrust refers to assumptions of criminality, where we assume that Black children are academically problems, right? So they're in, whether it's their academics or their behavior, the way that they engage, that they must be problems, they must be troublemakers, they must be bad students. And so it's a way of framing them in a criminalized sense. We also see a pervasive notion of disdaining them and the communities that they come from, saying that they're lazy, that they don't care, that they're not really here for school. There's a sense of them being less committed and less worthwhile, that the values, the communication styles, and the cultures of these individuals are lesser than those of others. And then also that they can be disregarded, their intelligence assumed to be academically inferior, that they can't be capable of doing the work. And so ultimately, we know those things have played out through COVID-19. Prior to COVID-19 and during it, we did collect data from the parents of Black children. And what we specifically looked at are children in preschool through third grade, what we would classify as early childhood education, that's preschool through third grade. And we talked to their parents about the experiences of their children. And so this first part is what took place before the pandemic. And so this is from a project called Our Voices that I've done in collaboration with my colleague and wife, Dr. Adar Essian from San Diego State. And essentially, from over 1,000 narratives of Black children or parents of Black children, we have found that there are 6 primary themes that are facing Black children in general. First, that they're assumed to be troublemakers. So the assumption is that they are troublemakers, right? That they have some sort of malintent. And on your screen, you can see words that are bolded that help to inculcate in our minds as to what this means. And we find that a lot of educators automatically assume that because they're troublemakers, that they're more likely to be liars, that they're more likely to cause a problem, that they're less likely to be trusted. And you can see in bold where one teacher said, well, the teacher said, well, the other kid said you started it. The assumption is that the problem started with the child who was Black, or going to the one on the bottom. But she most likely assumed that he was lying, talking about the young boy in that quote who had experienced an accident and had peed his pants in the classroom. We also see on this screen other examples of assumed to being troublemakers. And I'll just read this quote here on top. My son's teacher told me that she had moved him to a table up front. It was where she moved the children that had difficulty paying attention or behaving. My son was getting distracted in class. When I came to visit that table in the front, it was entirely populated by Black boys. I immediately demanded that he be moved. So this notion of criminality, so putting all the Black children at one table in the classroom. And I know that this has happened because I've had the same experience even with my own children as well. So first, assumed to be troublemakers, and then second, they're then labeled with terms that help to reinforce that notion. So on your screen are kinds of keywords that we oftentimes hear, and I would encourage you to feel free to use the chat window to share any others with us that you've heard as well, but they're called busy, physical, aggressive, bad, defiant, deregulated, hyperactive, troublemakers. These are the types of words that are used to frame Black children in certain ways that then those labels are attached to them and then follow them from teacher to teacher, from classroom to classroom. So assumed to be troublemakers, and then they're labeled with these terms. And then as a result, because of that, they're more likely to be closely watched because they're assumed to be the origin of anything bad that happens in the classroom. And so here's some quotes to help to show that. I would also witness them constantly watching my son. When I brought it up, they denied it. I explained that, of course, they would see him doing more things if they were always watching him. I witnessed other children doing the same things, and no one would even engage them. He was the only Black kid in school. We're going down to the quote on the bottom of your screen. My son was bullied at school, and I asked for investigation into the school because I knew they were not doing anything about it. This caused them to view every move he made, and he began to get into trouble for things his peers were not getting into trouble for because they were looking at him more closely. And then not only that, are they assumed to be troublemakers, labeled and more closely watched, we find that then they are singled out for discipline when this doesn't happen with other children. The best example I can give of this is you have 4 boys in kindergarten, and they're in the schoolyard, and they're throwing rocks against the fence. Now, should they be throwing rocks? Of course not. But is that age appropriate behavior for a young kid in kindergarten? Yes. But what we find is that the one Black or dark-skinned Latino boy in that group will be pulled out and reprimanded when nothing else happens to the other children. And so this notion that being singled out is a common experience among Black children. And I'm going to actually on this screen just go down to the third quote down because it helps to kind of reinforce this point. An incident happened where a Caucasian kid pointed out a rainbow, and about 3 other kids looked at it. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. Our son is quiet and tends to follow the crowd. Now, he can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he's singled out when 4 other kids seem to get a pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. That seems unfair. And so the treatment can be very different for young children, particularly Black children, particularly Black boys, even within that. And then they can be subject to harsher punishments. So harsher punishments take place in 2 different ways. One, it can be, for example, you have a Black child and a white child who get in trouble, or Black child and non-Black child who get in trouble. The non-Black child may lose their recess and the Black child will be suspended, or the Black child will be, or the non-Black child will be suspended and the Black child will be expelled. So it's always an elevated level in terms of what that looks like. Even at the earliest levels of schooling, one parent said, my son's 1st grade teacher would call home for every little infraction. Some of the punishments were often severe for even a small thing and didn't match the crime, such as turning around his seat one time will result in the whole day being marked bad. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on. But it also goes from there to even heightened levels of actual mistreatment, where we can see that Black children can be denigrated in spaces in a way that almost what I would say borders on abuse, or even sometimes doesn't even border on that. You can go to the 3rd quote down to see an example of what that looks like. My child was in 2nd grade and he made a joke. His teacher yelled at him and made him cry and said, 2nd grade is no place for jokes. She then made him stand in the front of the class, and the teacher and her associate continued to yell at him and call him a clown, a class clown. And he continued to cry, and they continued to yell at him. And the last pattern that we've seen, again, these are pre-COVID patterns, was this notion that Black children are troublemakers, and there must be an underlying disorder that's resulting in this. Here's examples that you're seeing in bold. Suggested that she had ADHD. Suggested that she needed to see a social worker. Thought my daughter had ADHD. Had disciplinary issues and also possibly a mental illness. And so these are the patterns that we have seen before the pandemic, but unfortunately, many of them continued through the pandemic. Now we're on to some of the newer stuff that I'm sure many of you haven't seen, which is that we have a survey that we have that's called the D3 Effect Inventory, which focuses on microaggressions experienced by young Black children in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade, early childhood education. And this was developed by myself, Idara Essien, Mohammed Khass, and Felicia Black. And essentially what we do when we see this instrument is we survey parents to list out the common types of microaggressions that we know are commonly experienced, and we find out to what degree is that true or not true. And of course, I will not say that every single child experiences every single type of microaggression, but we have found that there are certain microaggressions that are more common just during this COVID-19 era. And so when you look at this data, we find that when we ask parents, that over 36% of parents of Black children again, with children in early childhood education, have said that their teacher was surprised when their child succeeded academically, that there was a sense of surprise when they succeeded academically. And we've also have 34, almost 35% who said that their child was immediately disciplined for perceived wrongdoing, even when it wasn't them who did it, right? So they were immediately disciplined for a perceived wrongdoing without the ability to be able to explain themselves. And then 32% plus said that their child was singled out for punishment, even when they do the same thing as other children. I can say this, that before the pandemic, the number one theme that we had across all of our data, quantitative and qualitative, was this notion of being singled out, that Black children will engage in actions that are similar to other children, but they'll be the ones that are singled out for discipline as a way of framing to the rest of the classroom what not to be, how not to act, what not to do, right? And so it's that reinforcement of these kind of negative stereotypes that then attach them to our young Black children. And so you can see other patterns that played out during COVID-19 as well, being mistakenly identified as a child as the one who did wrong when they did not. And so actually, well, I'll come back to that. Praising other children for academic successes, even when their child performs at the same level, spending time watching my child for wrongdoing and assuming that my child is a cause of the problem when they tell their teacher that the other children have treated them poorly. And that last one is a really important one. We call that reverse causality. And essentially what happens is that when a Black child is picked on or bullied in a classroom, one of the things that we would like them to do as educators, right, is for them to approach the teacher and let the teacher handle it rather than trying to handle it themselves. But we find that when that occurs, that it's not uncommon, as you can see here, 30% of parents agreed with this, that they will be blamed. So, well, what is it that you did to cause this to occur? It's a victim blaming strategy that certainly only reinforces the difficulty of the experience for the Black child in that classroom. Now, when we look at the top three things that we see here, being surprised when my child succeeds academically, immediately disciplining them for perceived wrongdoing, and singling them out for punishment, we recognize that these patterns, when we look at them in our data, they do change over time, and they do differ by gender. So for example, being surprised when my child succeeds academically tends to, as a pattern, grow over time. And these are essentially percentages of parents who agreed with these statements based upon whether the child they were responding to was a boy or a girl. And so, like, for example, in preschool, you can find that 17% of parents agreed when their child was a young girl that the teacher was surprised when their child succeeded academically. But as you go up in age group, we find that changes and becomes even more pronounced by third grade, where almost 60% of the parents are agreeing with that statement. And so this is a pattern where we see that it adversely impacts Black children, but even more so Black girls. And it's a pattern that increases over time. And that's when it comes to, again, this focus on disregard for their intelligence. Now, when we go and we look at the measures of criminality, those top two, rounding out that top three, one of them was immediately disciplining my child for perceived wrongdoing. And then now you can see the pattern changes where it's more so pronounced among Black boys, where it begins in preschool, where 31% of the parents say that their child has been immediately disciplined for perceived wrongdoing, are already in preschool, the earliest levels of education where students are learning, are growing and developing and thinking about what school will be for them and what is their relationship to school and learning. And by third grade, that rises over 50%. And when we look at another measure of criminality, again, singling them out for punishment, we see a very similar pattern. Again, higher rates among Black boys, but higher in preschool and kindergarten, and becoming even more pronounced by the time you hit third grade. And these are data, again, now these data points were all collected during the middle of the pandemic. So some people might have said, well, our children, for many of them, weren't in school. They were engaging people in an online learning environment. And certainly in early childhood, some preschools, you would see that they would still be in person. But we had children who were, for the most part, not fully in person. And so wouldn't they be inoculated? Wouldn't they be protected from these experiences with racism? And ultimately, what we found is that wasn't the case, that these patterns persisted. And there was a differential of these patterns over the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, in May and July, we collected data and we continued collecting data. And we have a data point stoppage that we did in February and April, and we're going to have another one that we'll report out on soon. But we saw that as the pandemic wore on, some of the patterns began to intensify. So being surprised that a child succeeded academically was the #1 area of growth, where it went from 30.8% of parents in May and July of agreeing with that statement to in February, it jumped up to 43%, and that's a 12.3% jump. Or putting my child down in public when they provide a wrong answer, that also increased from roughly 13% to roughly 23%, a 10 percentage point jump. We also praising other children for academic successes, even when my child performs at the same level or higher level, meaning that is being restricted from them, and that also increased. And so we saw that the challenges facing Black children were not only pronounced during the pandemic, but some of the ways in which they were manifesting served to increase at the same time, while Black children were also dealing with the routinized execution of Black men, Black women, and those from the Black transgender community and non-binary community during the Black Lives Matter protests. And of course, that began long before then. Now, oftentimes we get this question, so we kind of wanted to preempt it. Is it all teachers who are doing this to Black children? Well, the answer to that is no, but it is true that Black children are treated with these same patterns across the board from all teachers. But we do know that the pronunciation of these patterns looks different based upon the race of the teacher, meaning that while some Black teachers will continue to assume that Black children are troublemakers, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, 14% if they're a Black female, 13% of parents agreed if they were a Black male. When you look at what that pattern looks like for white teachers, it's significantly higher, where in this case, 42% of parents of Black boys agreed that the teacher assumed that their child was a troublemaker, and 21% of the parents of Black girls. And so these are things that do differ across racial lines and further serve as a need for us to think about culturally proficient teachers and training for the teachers. Now, I want to now shift to some of the qualitative data that we collected during the pandemic as well. And this is based upon what were experiences of students during the Zoom environment, because so many students were logging on to Zoom and watching essentially their classrooms play out in this Zoom environment. And so what we did is we collected qualitative data from parents talking about what that looks like. And so here is the biggest theme that we saw across the board. And that was that children were being ignored in the classroom because they were viewed as being less important to the teachers. And it was the #1 theme that we saw across all the qualitative data during COVID-19, and even continuing to this point, which is this notion of being ignored in the classroom, which is a version of what we call second-class citizenship. Here are some quotes from parents of Black children that help to paint this picture. At the beginning of the school year, I was watching her and witnessed a teacher who's white call on every other student but her. She's the only Black student in the class. The teacher also ignored what she said when I know she was unmuted because I watched her turn on the microphone. He has sighed at her answers, and when she is asked for help multiple times, he just ignores her or addresses the whole class. Another parent said, he's the only Black student in the class. I have noticed that his teacher was very abrupt and not patient with him. She didn't even give him a moment to unmute himself in the Zoom class to respond to her. Another, and I'm going to the next page. Here's another set of feedback from one parent who said, last year when schools were closed due to COVID-19, I recalled an instance where my child was in her online class. The teacher was asking the class for an answer to a question she had just posed, and my daughter knew the answer and raised her hand. I was assisting in the room and was observing what was going on. My daughter sat there with her hand raised, and the teacher completely ignored her. And I asked some of the other children to answer the question. My daughter called out to the teacher and said that she knew the answer, and the teacher continued to ignore her and prompted some of the other kids in the class to respond. Finally, one little boy yelled out the answer. I watched as my child's entire mood changed. She became deflated after that. She completely withdrew and asked me why the teacher did not call on her. I had no answer, but it made me so angry because I immediately emailed the teacher and I told her that I personally witnessed the interaction and I scolded her via email for her behavior. Her excuse was that she did not see my daughter, the only Black child in her class, and tried to reinforce me that she treats all her students with the same fairness. Now, again, this was the number one theme that we saw, being ignored in the classroom. And so we are, of course, concerned with what that looked like during the pandemic and what that meant in terms of children's learning and development during the pandemic. For those of us who come from the Black community, it meant that we weren't prioritized, which isn't a surprise, but the outgrowth of what that means for young children is even more devastating. And then we have seen other patterns that have shown that criminality of Black children has continued. One of those patterns is the use of Zoom breakout rooms. For a period of time, we saw many teachers using Zoom breakout rooms as a way of doing a de facto suspension for Black children, where they would just move them to a breakout room and leave them there for a period of time. But we've seen other examples of being singled out for discipline. And here's where some parents have said to us, most hurtful, my son is treated as a disciplinary issue when playing like a boy or getting into normal trouble for his age group. The disciplinary issue is even more pronounced in COVID-19 for some reason. Or another parent who said, I have several times heard my child being disciplined on Zoom for something that another child said. Or another parent who said, my 7-year-old and second grade son experienced microaggressions issues during distance learning. He started to become disinterested in school and felt like he wasn't smart enough, good enough, and that he couldn't get anything right. His grades started to suffer and his spirit was broken. The teacher would constantly reprimand him and was frustrated because he would not sit still during distance learning. It felt like my son was being criminalized and singled out. He was one of 2 Black students in the class. And so now that I'm done presenting this data, I want to just move very quickly just to say, why does it matter before we move into the time of Q&A? And it matters because these issues our Black children experience serve to, and I'm skipping ahead here, serve to affect them in 2 very key ways. One, it affects them through what we call race sliding. Race sliding is a concept that I created with my colleague and friend, Dr. Frank Harris III. And essentially what it is it's gaslighting, but experienced by people of color. And we know that students of color, teachers of color, staff of color, administrators of color, faculty of color, all experience race sliding. And essentially what it is the microaggressions of distrust, disdain, and disregard become so routinized in our experiences that we begin to start to second guess ourselves. And you might come to a point where you see a child, and that last quote almost pointed out an exact example of this, saying to himself, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Well, regardless of what it is, those messages, that doubt, that disorientation, that's race sliding. And ultimately, another concept that we have to be attentive to is the work that's been done by William A. Smith from the University of Utah on racial battle fatigue. And if you haven't read anything that's been done by Dr. Smith, I would tell you that you've been missing out on some of the most important and impactful work that's been done in this decade, not in this decade, really, I would say on this side of the century, looking at racial battle fatigue and how it influences the experiences of our Black students. And ultimately, what it is a framework for making sense of the effects of racism. And what he has found is that racism has a psychological effect and a physical effect on the bodies of individuals who are people of color. And that effect is similar and akin to combat stress syndrome. And it can be physical symptoms such as a tension headache, a backache, an elevated heartbeat, an upset stomach, extreme fatigue. And in fact, many of you may be familiar with, say, a young Black child in preschool, first grade, second grade, who says that their stomach hurts in the morning because they don't want to go to school. And why is it that their stomach hurts? Is because they're in an environment where racialized stress is taking place, and their body is having a physical response to that environment. And lastly, that there can be psychological symptoms as well. Constant anxiety and worrying, increased swearing and complaining, inability to sleep, loss of confidence is a big one. Emotional and social withdrawal, anger suppression, resentment. All these are signs that racial battle fatigue are occurring. And ultimately, from what we've seen from the pandemic, when you put together the pandemic of COVID-19 and the continuing pandemic of anti-Blackness, I would say that racial battle fatigue is the constant in the experiences of our Black students in school and the Black faculty, teachers, and counselors that serve them. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Dr. Madison to continue this important conversation.
Outstanding, Dr. Wood. Thank you so much for not only walking us through that, but also sharing with us directly from your own academic scholarship and your own academic work and what you found and what you have been observing. I think in looking through the chat, in the comments in the chat, as well as in the Q&A, there's a lot of resonance and a lot of agreement to which others have experienced many of these things directly. I think probably most of us on this call have experienced this in one way, shape, and or form, if not many. And so we do have several questions that have been asked kind of while you were going, as well as in the Q&A. So we'll go ahead and kind of begin to ask a few of those. I would ask the board for questions that were in the chat that we haven't addressed. If you can either add them directly to the Q&A so we don't lose them in all the comments, that would be great. So the first question, or one question I have that answer, were the same families asked if things change? For example, when you were talking about the study that you did and you looked at that data set where all the parents were asking about their input or how their children feel or what they've observed. And so the question is, for the Black children that being perceived as more aggressive or surprised for their academic excellence in the 2 times during the pandemic that the data was collected.
Someone has background noise for some reason.
Okay, a little better now?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Much.
So the question was, were the same families that were in the data set that you were looking at things like their perceptions around being more aggressive, or they were surprised that their academic performance was excellent? What was the demographic of those families, but then also were they polled, I guess, more than once? Because you showed 2 sets of data. Was it the same families or those different groups?
The different subgroups over the period of time, but what we did in terms of our analysis to determine which ones to present is we did independent samples tests to determine like the difference between one group versus another independent group. And in terms of the demographics, the vast majority of the parents in the sample were Black or African American themselves, being the parents of Black children. But there was a percentage, of course, that weren't, for those who may be Black children of mixed race being raised by non-Black parents, or those who may be like myself, who are part of the foster or care system or were adopted. And so, but that's a much smaller subset of that sample. In terms of the representation, all the regions are pretty much well represented in our data, but the Southern region. We've had in generally a limitation to all of our studies really in terms of collecting data in the South, where we've had significantly lower response rates. But in terms of the Northeast, the Midwest, the Western United States, all heavily represented within that data.
Excellent. So again, thanks, Alice DeSerto, for that question. Arnell Hill, they ask, what are your tips on combating the negative feedback our children are receiving? And would you suggest weekly contact with teachers or administrators? What type of strategies would you suggest as being effective?
Well, I actually think that that's one of the best things about today's webinar, is that we're going to talk about some real specific strategies that people can do to help. But in terms of what I recommend, one thing I always recommend is creating a group of parents at your school, what we call a Parents of Black Children group. It doesn't have to be called that, but ultimately bringing all the parents of Black children together and going and meeting with your school leadership and asking them to just to listen and allow the parents to go around the room and share the experiences of their students. Often we find that parents, one, think that their experiences are isolated, when in fact many children are experiencing the same thing. And oftentimes educators themselves even see these issues as isolated, and bringing everyone together in a common room helps to demonstrate that it's a pattern. But the most important thing is not just to have one meeting, but to have a expectation that there will be subsequent meetings. So we're here this month, we'll be back in 2 weeks, or we'll be back next month, and then the month after that, and the month after that, and the month after that. They will be more attentive if they think that you're not going away, that it's not a one-time conversation or a one-off. If they think that it's an ongoing conversation and that they're going to have to account for what the experiences are on an ongoing basis, then they will respond differently. And one of the most important things you can do as part of that is ask the school to show you their referral data, so that when you come back next month, we want to see this month's referral data. What do the referrals look like to the in terms of write-ups in the classroom, referrals to the office, those who have been given detention, suspensions, whatever the data is, but disaggregated by race. Don't just say that, have them give it to you overall, have them disaggregate by race and present that to you. They can hand it to you, you can give feedback, and you can give it back to them in the middle of that room. But ultimately, the data itself should guide the conversation, and the schools should be responsible for providing that data. And if they're not, reach out to us and we'll give you some suggestions on how to make that happen.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thank you. Arnell, thanks for that question. So we have another question from Michael Martin. Michael Martin Jr. asks, prior to this meeting convening, he emailed the admin with 2 questions for the panel. Oh, yeah. So we'll, So anyway, sorry. So he sent some questions in advance. I think a couple of our board members have some questions that were sent prior. We'll work on getting those in. Rosalie Rush, she asks, she says, there's a big demographic of kids in group homes that don't have representation. And so those students that aren't kind of paired, with some, their parents, right? What type of advocacy models would you suggest for students that are in this situation, particularly those in special ed?
Oh gosh, well so if their child is in special education because they need the services, then it's using the services and making sure that you're aware of all of your rights and what the school can do and cannot do regarding your child. It takes a different level of advocacy in order to be able to do that, because the schools will oftentimes use special education as a dumping ground for Black children. Now, it can be a wonderful service if your child needs it. And when they do need it, it can help to really provide them with the support they need. Now, there's also parents who will have children who will have either been recommended for special education or placed into special education who don't need it and are there based upon the fact that the school thinks of them in a way that is stereotyped. And ultimately, in that case, it's about recognizing a number of different things. One, the school cannot do an assessment on your child unless you consent. So if the school comes to you and says that we brought somebody in to do an assessment and they've determined that your child needs these services, that is not accurate, that is not appropriate, and you should be reaching out to someone in the local area who can provide you with support. I would say that in every major city, there's a college of education. And in that college of education, there's usually faculty members who are Black or African American. I would encourage, when you have challenges, reaching out to them. We spend a lot of time. It's not part of our jobs, but it's part of what we believe in. We do helping parents navigate around these issues and providing advice, going to meetings with them when the school is going to be meeting about their student. And so because it was a general question, that's a more generalized response, but certainly can respond to anything more specific if it comes up.
Excellent. So Yolanda Beckles, she asks, before Black parents walk in, they have to be trained and organized. So she says there must be Black trained parent advocates nationally. And so she asks, how can our Black academics and professors assist with this type of activity, training parents to be able to engage in that meaningful and kind of a long, protracted way where we do continued follow-up?
Yeah, well, I would say that I'm sure the ACEI would certainly welcome individuals who want to volunteer their time and helping to support that mission. And so, Jonathan, I would leave that to you. But I would also say that my organization, Black Minds Project, absolutely is very interested in anybody who would want to support those efforts. And I'll put my email in the chat if anybody's interested in helping become part of our of the work that we're doing around providing support for parents and for their families.
Absolutely. And I will just jump in there while you put that in the chat. We, the Alpha Community Education Initiative, one of our main drivers and goals is developing the capacity as well as the tools of the population for us all to be advocates. And so what we're going to do in just a little bit, we're actually going to get into some more practical application and provide some specific tools that you all can use even as templates to engage with your school board, to engage with local elected officials, as well as how to leverage social media to bring additional awareness to many of these issues and how to advance the conversation. And so one of the things that we are doing also, which we'll hear about a little bit later, is a day of action where we actually plan to and will be taking this message, taking the collective, all who are willing to come with us, and have some of these conversations with local officials, like the elected officials, as well as school boards throughout the country. And so we have 3 target sites currently: Denver, Phoenix, and LA. But we're certainly willing to add more. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the details for those things. But if anyone is interested, would like to know more about that, please email us at info@educatingourfutures.org. And we'll be happy to share that with you as we're developing this training material to make you qualified advocates to be able to ask and seek out and get responses and do the follow-up. So yeah, so just wanted to add that in. And Hattie McFraser, she asks about data getting out to the public and educational systems. How much of this information is, I guess, being disseminated? How much of this information is out there? Dr. Wood, you've done over 1,000 presentations, scholarly presentations in this space. You've been, featured on C-SPAN. You've been featured on National Press Club, Miami Herald, Los Angeles Times. Are you still seeing people, families, communities feel like many of these experiences are just them? Or are we coming to a point where we're kind of seeing that this is a pandemic, right? This is a larger than my individual situation is experiencing this. This is a larger issue.
Yeah, actually, I'm still seeing people who feel like it's just them. And part of it is because of the incredible diversity within the Black community. So for example, we host a session every year here in San Diego in collaboration with either the county office or with the district that's focused. It's called Black Minds Matter. And we bring together parents of Black children. We provide data that's going on in terms of what we're seeing in the district or across the county. And we encourage people to kind of share their stories and use that to galvanize. And in San Diego, we have a very diverse Black population. We have individuals who've been in Southeast San Diego for multiple generations. We have transplants such as myself. We have our military population. We have a large population of East African immigrants. And so all these different populations. But the interesting thing is when you bring them all together and they start sharing their stories, the things that make us say to one another that they're different from me, they can't understand what my experience is like, ultimately they evaporate and realize that we're all part of the same experience, which is that unfortunately our children are criminalized in the classroom. They're treated in ways that are disrespectful to them, unfortunately, and they are assumed to be academically inferior. And it's the combination of those experiences that create the Black experience in school. And so from my experience, it has really not been something where people have learned to come together yet over this pandemic, because even now when we have these conversations, it's a sense of surprise and people will say, I thought it was me. I thought it was just my child. And just a simple bit of reassurance to all those who are here who are experiencing this, it is not you. It is not your child. It is all of our children. And that's why we all have to work together.
Well said. Absolutely. And so I would even offer as a representative of ACEI, we actually, believe it or not, we initially galvanized around the idea of trying to develop a charter school or a specific school model where we could work with a handful of teachers, a handful of students, right? And really kind of make a very specific impact. But the more we began to be involved in this educational space, we realized these issues are far reaching, right? They're systemic and they're institutional, right? And so this requires a systemic as well as institutional response. And so that only happens through pressure, right? And through a little bit of heat, but also through data and keeping people accountable, right? And so what gets measured gets done, right? And what gets brought to light actually gets the attention. And so we're here now trying to begin that, partner with Dr. Wood as well as the work he's doing to begin bring this to light a little bit more, provide some of that data, but also give you all some tangibles. And so Lisa Best, she asked, what suggestions or resources can we provide to inform, empower, and be a layer of protection for those that have no voice or strength? And what can we do to amplify our voice as stakeholders, advocates, and change agents? And so, Dr. Wood, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but I would want to just make a quick plug here on this because I think this is like a perfect segue. This is not a planted question; it's actually a question from the audience. So, if you go to www.educatingourfuture.org, look on the main nav under Day of Action. And we're going to dive into these in a little bit. But if you look under Day of Action, you'll see several drop-down links and a nav, and you'll see resources for op-eds. You'll see resources for social media. You'll also see resources for engaging school board. And we provide some very simple, brief, concise guides and some tutorials about how to do those things, as well as even creating a basic template to begin to help develop it. And so again, we're about developing capacity. This is not the work of any one person. No one person is going to be able to change all of this, right? Dr. Wood's been in this space for a long time, right? And this issue it persists, right? And so it's going to take all of us because, as Dr. Wood said, it's all of our children, right? And so, but that's a place you can start, and we're going to dive into many of those in again just a little bit. Dr. Wood, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, we just briefly, one place I think they can go to is the Black Minds Project. So that you just go to the bmmcoalition.com, and there we have a link. It's to a program that we operate where parents who are experiencing challenges with their students in school, they can go there and they can basically report an issue. And then basically we'll do is we will help respond and provide support to those parents through that situation. And that program is called A Friend of the Family. And sometimes that's what you need in these circumstances is a friend of the family to join you so that you know that you're not alone. The other thing that I would tell people to do, and I'm going to put into the chat window right now, there's a link to a live YouTube of this event that's taking place. Help us spread the word. Go to that YouTube. If you think this conversation is positive and value added, like it, share it, would be even better on your social media. We want to ensure as many people as possible see what's going on, but also see some of the solutions and recommendations that we have offer and will be offering today.
So we'll take a couple of more questions. So I have three, I'm Mountain Time, so I have 3:57. So we'll take a couple of more questions and then we're going to move into the next segment because we do want to be attentive and respectful of everyone's time. And so I think I see maybe three more right now in the chat. And so I think we'll have room for maybe one more question in the Q&A, then we're going to have to transition. But again, if we didn't get to your question, we try to get to as many as we could in the Q&A. I think we got to all of them. But if I see a lot going on in the chat, so we will certainly follow up. We're happy to answer questions offline. I know Dr. Wood is also happy to engage in this space. And so I see a couple more. I see one from Francine, one from Lori, and one from Joel. And then we'll entertain one more, and then we're going to have to transition. So Francine Maxwell asks, what do you say to Black educators that may feel helpless to help, right? That they may have, very significant vested interest in being able to collect a paycheck to feed their own family, right? And may not be able to kind of take on the systemic challenges, right, that may be going on that, if dismantled, could potentially, impact their livelihood. What do you say to those persons?
Well, first of all, hello to Francine, who's my local NAACP president and just an amazing leader in our area in San Diego, someone who I look up to in terms of the work that she does. I would say that I would add to that question, not just the difficulty in doing it for those reasons, but also because you're experiencing racial battle fatigue and race sliding at the same time. And so people look to Black educators oftentimes to be a solid rock for them in these times when they may feel like personally that they're nothing more than a bag of pebbles, because they're broken themselves going through all of these different events in terms of the loss of COVID-19 and the routinized pain that we see on the television of Black people. But I would say that it is a difficult thing to say, but ultimately we don't have a responsibility. We have to press forward and we have to do what we can to support our people while also trying to balance that out with the self-care that we need. And if we don't advocate, if we don't push, if we don't raise these issues, then we have to recognize that we're doing so from a standpoint of privilege that our children don't have. A child in preschool doesn't have the ability to be able to say, oh, I'm just not going to engage, right? They are going to be in a classroom where they're treated with disrespect. And what most people don't realize is that many children spend more time at school with educators than they do with their own parents and their own family members. Because if you think about when they get home, right, and if they're in sports or if they're any other extracurricular activities, and by the time they go to sleep and they're asleep at nighttime, the amount of time with their parents is oftentimes very restricted. And so if you think that their experience is one that is less than ideal, is one where they feel marginalized, hyper surveilled, or invisible, or hyper surveilled and invisible at the same time, think about it, that is their primary experience in life. And so your primary experience in life can be your primary experience in school. And that's why we have to continue to advocate and show that Black minds matter, regardless of the cost.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. So there was one question in the chat around all the resources that are kind of coming out through the chat and being posted. And so we will take an action to aggregate all of those and then make those available on our website in terms of general resources, right? Because again, this is not something that can be done by one group or one set of people. So we will be somewhat of a clearinghouse and communicating some of these resources out. So at least all that we have captured through the chat and through the communications today. So we'll take an action on to do that. You can look for that within the next week on educatingourfuture.org. Another question. So last two questions. Lori Farmer, she asks, from the standpoint of those schools and school districts that work on the district level, what are some ways we should engage principals and school administrators in changing the culture or the climate in their sites or schools and locations?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that we can do that I think that we need to, in terms of reemphasizing these with our school leaders. First, I think you have to show them their own data. Unfortunately, oftentimes when I show suspension data to a school, the most common response that I get is, where did you get this data from? And even when it's the school and the individual from that school who submitted it to the state, which sounds laughable, but it's actually been the constant in terms of my own experience. And so I recommend showing the school their data. And there's ways in which you can get that data that's publicly available in the state. If you're in the state of California, you go to cde.ca.gov. If you're in other states, you go to your state Department of Education. You can also pull great data from the Schott Foundation. I know Brother Akbar also has some great resources that are available that he has access to. So lots of data available, but one first thing, show the school. Second thing I would recommend is, again, pulling together parents and talking to those school leaders, telling them about the experiences that your child is having and the other children are having. Another thing I would say is never assume that the challenges facing your child are isolated, because again, other children are probably experiencing it. Don't allow the principal of your school or a teacher to refer to your child as a problem, as hyper physical, aggressive, defiant, or any of the other labels that come along with that. I would say that you should demand that the educators at your school be trained to teach and engage Black children, and that they be trained in racial trauma and what that looks like and how it impacts students in school. Because I'm at the point where I'm going to go as far to say that if an educator isn't trained on how to engage racialized stress and racialized trauma and to create a healthier environment for our students, then they're not someone who should be teaching Black children. Because ultimately, they're going to be doing more damage than good, even if they have the best of intention. The roadway to hell is paved with good intentions. And unfortunately, we have to start to separate intent from impact, because someone can have a good intent and still have a bad impact. But ultimately, that bad impact has a lasting effect on our Black children. And coming out of a pandemic, and I know we're still in it to some degree, but it's not the same as it was before. Like, we're now starting to see the ramifications of what occurred. And what occurred was some serious harm. And it's going to take us years for many of our students to be able to overcome where they were at. And we knew that before the pandemic, we weren't starting out in the same playing field. So that's why this meeting is a call to action, because we are in a dire situation. I think that action is desperately needed. And that's why I'm glad that ACEI has stepped up to provide some guidance on what that should look like. And I'm just glad to be part of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, so these are the last question. I think these kind of go a little bit well, maybe not hand in hand, but so Joel Hart asks asking a question around critical mass, right? Kind of what does that look like? How many people do we need to touch? How many, what does success look like in terms of informing a population, and then, that we, should be able to kind of begin to get over them to affect the systemic issues. And then I don't know if you can address this, Luke, or if you have thoughts, but there was also a question from Dahlia Balmir around any resources on tapping into Black clinicians. So I don't know, maybe someone else in the chat may have some suggestions as well, but could you opine on those two things?
Yeah, let me start out with the Black clinicians one first. I think tons of resources that I would recommend. I saw a note from Deborah Watkins in here with her organization. I would definitely suggest that's a great group, as well as the Association of Black Psychologists, which I saw that she also highlighted. I would also say you should, if you're a clinician, you should be working with Black children and in a way that you're serving to prepare them. So you should, at the very least, be steeped in multicultural counseling, in trauma-informed practices, in cultural relevance, in implicit bias, in microaggressions, in race lighting, and definitely, almost invariably, in racial battle fatigue, right? Those should be things that you're comfortable talking about. There are professional associations that do a lot of work in these areas. I would say that if you haven't read anything by William Smith from the University of Utah, congratulations, you're about to enter into a whole new world about what these experiences really mean for our students and for our children. I would also say that I've done a lot of training, even though I'm not a counselor or a psychologist. I've done a lot of training working with those who are, to help them think through how can we better support our students in terms of our practice and in terms of the case management that we're doing. And so I think that there's a lot of individuals out there who have that expertise. I could also recommend Ebony Zamani Gallagher from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is another person who's an incredible thought leader in this area who'd be good to look at their work as it relates to this, since she's a psychologist as well. And in terms of the critical mass, I mean, I think the critical mass starts today. The people who are going to join a voluntary webinar on serving Black children in the midst of the pandemics on a Sunday, right, are those who are already committed to the work. So we're just glad you're here, and we're glad you're committed to the work and pushing forward, and we need your help. And we need your help because we all have to be working together. We all need to start bringing our organizations together, because the problem that we have faced has never been as big as it is now. And it's a time for us to do that. In terms of what critical mass looks like, I don't know if we ever get to the point where I can say that we're going to have achieved what that mass needs to be, given the scope of the problem. But it's one of those things where no matter how big the fight is, it doesn't mean that we let down, that we don't push forward. And ultimately, we have to recognize that this is a battle, and it's a battle for the future of our people. And unfortunately, given what's happened through COVID-19, there's some long-term effects that if we're not attentive to, that if we're not engaging in them directly right now, that we're not going to be supporting the best interests of our students. And so that's why we're working together with ACEI. We invite other organizations to join in with us. We want to see this move forward, and let's just build the mass together. And hopefully we'll get to a point when we know that all of our children can be treated with dignity in schools. And that's what this is all about. We just want our kids to have dignity in school. That seems like a lofty goal at this point, but it's one that we have to achieve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Akbar back up as we begin to transition. And while he's doing that, Dr. Wood, I'm sorry, don't go just a second. I need you transition because you need to do part of the breakout. But Akbar, if you could maybe enable your video once you're ready. There were two more questions that kind of came out, and I think they kind of speak to what you were really just touching on as we're kind of trying to close the Q&A out. And it's these. So it's actually three came in. So Ujanwa Akebu, I'm sorry, I apologize if I butcher your name. She asked if any of those resources that you mentioned were good at leading trainings around racialized trauma. And then Yolanda Beckles, or if you have any other suggestions on racialized trauma, or people that train in that space. Yolanda Beckles, she asked, given the fact that this has been going on for about over 60 years, and we haven't gotten much change to the systematic issues, should we be focused more on Black homeschooling? And then just a general question about data by Gaetano Lerdieri. She asked, do we have any data, or does any of your studies look at stats for autistic Black and brown children? And are they treated any, more the same as some of the trends that we're seeing in the larger populations? So apologize, I know that's a handful, but I don't know if maybe you can speak to a couple of those things.
Yes, I'll let Dr. Akbar go first, see if he wants to respond to those, and then I'll chime in too.
I thought they were directed to you, so I didn't even hear the first question.
Around racialized trauma. Do we know any experts that are doing training and leading people to understand as well as how to respond and not perpetuate racialized trauma?
Yeah, I can't think of anyone off the top of my head at this point, but I'm sure there are tons of people that does it, and obviously, Dr. DeGroy is probably the first person that comes to my mind to think about. And you can probably YouTube her. She has a lot of videos on YouTube, and I think she tells this one story about even her being in the grocery store that I found pretty good. But as far as doing more trainings, I can't think of anybody off the top of my head right now around racialized trauma, but I know there are some. Okay.
And then maybe Dr. Akbar and Dr. Wood, if you guys can speak, what is the practicality or likelihood or advantage to us starting to talk more about homeschooling, right? Is changing the public education sector not going to happen? Do we need to abandon that and just look towards homeschooling? Yolanda Beckles asked this question.
I got to say, I've seen a lot more parents homeschooling than ever before. And when I ask them why, almost invariably, it's because they feel like they can provide a safer environment. Here's the thing. I'm an educator, and obviously I care deeply about learning. I think that there's nothing more important than a child learning new concepts, new ideas, new theories, and exploring our world. But I also know that what is even more important is being in an environment that is socially and emotionally healthy. And I understand why a number of parents are doing that. I still believe in them in public schools, and that public schools and private schools can continue to turn it around. But I also know that not every school can serve our students well. And interestingly, in my experience, the best schools on paper are some of the schools that do the biggest disservice to our Black students. In fact, we did a report. It was focused in San Diego. It was called When They Teach Us. It was a play on Ava DuVernay's documentary, When They See Us. And ultimately, what we did is we identified the top suspension schools in the county. And we then went to greatschools.org and identified which ones of these have scores of 7, 8, 9, and 10, like the best schools on paper. And more than half the list was schools that were rated as having 7, 8s, 9s, or 10s as being quote unquote great schools. And so That's why I always give the advice from my colleague, Andre Branch, who said, never leave your child in an unhealthy environment, even for the sake of a good school. You get your kid into that magnet school, that charter school, that local public school, whatever it is you're looking for. And sometimes we leave our children too long because we want the best for them.
Mhm.
But sometimes what we're doing is we're only setting them up for long-term damage. A healthy environment is just as important as the academic learning in that environment. And hopefully in most environments, those two things can go hand in hand. But let's just be real, they don't always do so. Lastly, in terms of people who I would recognize in terms of racialized trauma, I would say William Smith from the University of Utah would be probably my number one go-to in terms of the work that he does. I would say Frank Harris III from San Diego State. We do a lot of work on race lighting and what that looks like in terms of how that affects students and educators of color. I mentioned Ebony Zamani Gallagher, who I know Dr. Akbar has experience with as well, who's a brilliant mind and really brings a lot to this space. And there's so many other people out there who are doing great work. And even people who I'm looking on this, and I'm seeing your names who are part of this webinar, who I know have been in the field, in the trenches for years doing this work. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being part of this community that's moving this effort forward.
And then the last question was around academic work looking at statistics for autistic Black and brown children. Is anyone doing that work just yet? This is a question from Gaetano Ladieri.
I'm sure that there are. I don't personally do that work. In terms of those who I know do work focus on special education and Black children, Fred Bonner does great work on that. Donna Y. Ford does amazing work on that, great work on that as well. There are a number of other scholars who are also doing work in this area. You can go back to some of the foundational work in the field with Jawanza Kunjufu. I will say this, that I have sat on some panels recently with individuals who do specialize in this area. And one of the things that I've learned from those experiences is that because there can be sometimes an underlying disability, that the assumptions of criminality can play out in even more visceral ways, because there's an assumption that, oh, they're acting strange. And so the immediate assumption is that they need to control or to engage them in a much more physical and aggressive way. And in fact, because this was brought up, I hope you'll just beg me for one moment where I just show a chart here just really quick, because it's really important for this related to that question. This is data from California on the use of restraint and seclusions and exclusions in a classroom as a form of discipline. So in this chart, you'll see the red bars. Black children, as on the far right, left-hand side, account for 5.3% of the enrollment. So 5.3%, that's all. But when we look at those who are subject to mechanical restraints, physical restraints, and seclusions, which is really primarily our special education population for some of these areas, or at least an overdensity for sure, you can see that Black students are overwhelmingly overrepresented in these areas. So I can't speak to that pattern in specific to those specific categories, but I did point out some scholars that I would recommend taking a look at their work. And ultimately, I think what you'll find is that, unfortunately, that it provides another area of marginality for Black children to be further treated with distrust, disdain, and disregard.
Excellent, excellent. So we do need to transition. And so we just want to quickly remind and actually just provide visuals. So if this conversation is helpful, we certainly think it is. We would encourage you to do a couple of things as we move into this next portion. Visit us at www.educatingourfuture.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can follow us. The handle on each is ACEI06. And we really want to actually be sure we do more than just talk, and we want to take action, right? And so, Dr. Akbar, I think you have something you want to offer around taking this charge and our charge, and we want to know if you want to also make a commitment to act, because we want to move the community forward as well as address these issues. And so we need all of us to affect this issue. So Dr. Akbar.
Thank you very much, Brother Dr. Madison, for really leading this day. And Dr. Wood, thank you for a great discussion and laying the foundation for the challenges that we have ahead that are facing our children. And I really want to call your attention to the QR code that is on the screen there. We're going to ask you to commit to act, to commit to lead an action in your community, to do a small or great task in your community. We are leading Day of Actions across this country. We hope that you will partner with us and lead one in your area between the weeks of November 4th and November 18th. We hope that you join us. And so I want to ask each and every one of you who on this webinar will champion the innovations that our young people so deserve. Who on this webinar is ready to seize this moment? And that requires each and every one of us to cause maybe a little discomfort for those in power, because that comfort is really leading to negative impacts, even though the intent may be well. Who on this webinar is ready to give up mediocrity and give up accepting that it is okay that our Black boys and our Black girls are being suspended at higher rates and are disregarded and treated as if they're criminals? Who on this webinar is ready to empower their community and to forge a path towards the greatest opportunity for success and dignity in education for each and every one of our young people? Who on this webinar is ready to commit to an execution of an action in their community for better equitable outcomes in their schools for all students that you have? Who on this webinar is ready to stand up for a sense of urgency to change something along with others in your community, your friends, and those that you know, to not just sit, but stand wedded to dismantling the status quo and not accepting what we get? We need each and every one of you to commit to an action, to go back into your communities, to be the spark that ignites the flame of justice and renewed faith in the power of people and the power of public education, that it can work for each and every one of our children. And it can give us the education that we deserve. Transformation is really needed now. We've waited so long to get to this point, and there's no more time to kick the can down the road. And so it's time to increase our pace. Instead of just pacing for those who have privilege, it's time for us to really step up and lead the charge and be active and engaged and in their face more than just one time. And so we're going to give you an opportunity to do that. We're going to provide you the tools to do it in your community. And we have breakout groups that will help show you the way. And so if you are ready to commit to act, please fill out that form, that quick 3-minute survey with your information, with that QR code, and the link is actually at the bottom if that QR code is not working for you. And then today, once you decide what you're going to do, are you one of those individuals who can just write an op-ed? You believe that you have a compelling story that could get across to those who make decisions in your community? Are you someone who feels as though you and a critical mass of 10 people or more can go to a school board meeting and they stand while you speak and share why equitable practices is something that we should be paying attention to? Are you someone who don't have time to go to the meeting, maybe not be the one who wants to put your name on an op-ed, but are willing to share some statistics and some information on some social media and to get some traction and to make sure those individuals who do have the power to speak and have the time to speak can have that information and they're armed well? Are you someone who wants to make sure that the state level is making the policies that they need to make and the laws they need to make in order to make sure that it makes it easier for your local government to serve your students? We will show you those tips and tricks today to get you on your way. And we ask that you sign up so that we can communicate with you and you can share with us what you've done on your day of action. So thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to speak, and we really need you. If this presentation did not do something with your spirit, if it didn't ignite the soul in your belly to act, then I don't know what will, because I think it was glaring, and we need everybody to sing to the mountaintops and to be consistent on the message. Dr. Madison?
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Akbar. So without any further ado, we would like to transition to the breakout sessions. And so we do have 4 breakout sessions. And Dr. Akbar, I think you'll put the links in the chat for all to participate, those who would like to. Again, this is where we're getting some practicals. And so Ron Rice, he's going to be talking about how to engage with your local elected officials, right? How to affect legislation. And you can look in the chat, we'll be putting those Zoom links there shortly. Also, you can also join myself. I'll be talking about social media tactics. And so we'll kind of walk through the lay of the land there, as well as how you leverage social media to bring not only awareness to these actions, but also bring some pressure to impact change. Also, Dr. Akbar will be leading a session where he will focus on engaging school boards, right? How to talk to them and how to work with them and how to, again, apply pressure to get a response. And then Dr. Luke Wood will be sharing about op-eds, how to begin to write in a way in which we can bring additional light to these issues, as well as get the message out to all that need to see it. There's an ancient African proverb that I appreciate that says, until lions have historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And so we need lions to have historians. And so that means you, me, and the rest of all of us, right? And so the links are there. I see 3, but we will continue to post them here. And so we would encourage you to go ahead and visit these links and you can engage. We'll begin in 5 minutes in each of those sessions, talking about how to make op-eds, how to make compelling op-eds, how to engage with local officials, elected officials, how to engage a school board, as well as how to leverage social media. And so with that, we will draw this portion to a close. Thank you for your time and your attention. And we encourage you to engage with us just a little bit longer as these experts speak on how you can tangibly use these tools to begin to affect and impact the change that we've been speaking about for this last hour. And Angelica, yes, we are recording it. And so we will make this available, the recording available to others. Okay, we'll see you in the breakout sessions.
Brother Rice, I am making you the host here. So I'm going to lose my capabilities, so you know.
No problem.
All right, I'm off to my session. Good luck, brother.
Thank you. Are we free to start now, or should we give Bilks the 5 minutes that we said?
Yeah, Brother Rice, I think about 5 minutes.
Okay,
Yeah, folks are still trying to make their way in and out of different rooms.
no problem. And how long is this particular breakout session? I just want to make sure I don't go over time and leave room for question and answers.
Good question. Let me see. I think we need to make up some time.
Yeah, we initially talked about starting at the top of this hour, so we're way behind, and we were supposed to plan for. This was supposed to be 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So we're going to cut down to about 15, 20?
That should work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
You got it. Okay, folks, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and start. So thank you all for picking this breakout session. I know there were so many, and I hope we're all were electrified by Dr. Woods and his presentation, really framing the challenge and what we need to do as a community. My name is Ron Rice, as was stated at the top of the discussion. I am currently the Senior Director for Government Relations at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, which is the only federal advocacy organization on behalf of 3.3 million kids currently attending about 7,500 charter schools across the nation in 45 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Before then, I was a Newark, New Jersey City Councilman, where I served for 2 terms, working on a number of issues. Before that, worked as a special assistant to the commissioner in the Department of Education in the state of New Jersey. So I've been working in government and politics and advocacy for a little over 30 years at this point. So I don't know if I'm an expert, but I'm certainly someone who has had a lot of experience doing it. The success rate of my ability, I guess, is yet to be determined. But I want to jump right in because we're talking about sort of how do we access effectively and interrelate and speak with and communicate with elected officials at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level for issues that are important to you. And I will start off with a definition of advocacy, at least the way I look at it. I term advocacy as the natural and necessary process within a democracy of responding to problems with concrete solutions organized into campaigns to achieve a clear goal in a specific amount of time. That's a sort of very basic, bare bones definition of advocacy, but that's what it is in the public sector, in the public square. The trouble has been is that as we have all grown up to learn about what advocacy looks like a lot and how do we talk to government, we always kind of go back to what we were taught in high school and grammar school in terms of civics classes. We were taught, the 3 levels of government. And that's nice, but it doesn't really tell you how to access power. It doesn't really teach you how to influence decision makers. It doesn't really help you to find out how you can be an activist in government and not just someone who has to sit back and just take whatever is given. And then every 4 years, we say nothing ever changes, nothing has ever changed. And there's some real reasons why that is actually the case. So I want to do real quickly, talk about the characteristics of elected officials and the characteristics of power. We don't have a lot of time, so if I speak very fast, I apologize to the interpreter beforehand, but let's go. So, and what is an elected official? It's someone that has been voted on by registered voters in a particular jurisdiction to be in elected office and to pass budgets, write legislation, oversee, if it's a legislative branch, the executive branch of government. If it's the executive branch, it gives the power to a mayor or a governor to actually implement what the legislature actually passes. And there are 2 types, in my opinion, and in my experience. There's the politician, the ones who are in it for the power, and then there's the public servant who's in it to actually make a difference in their communities. The trouble is that both of them have to be accessed if you're looking to engage with elected officials. The pros of a politician is that they typically are the ones who get the most things done in a transactional way, but they're actually responsible for getting things done. The negatives about a politician is that they're opt and it's about a power situation with them. Those who have the most power get the most access and get the most things out of them. Those who do not are simply left by the wayside. The public servant is someone who probably does the right thing for the right reasons, but the cons are they typically don't have too much power, are not able to get a lot of things done. But both are in a political office, elected office, and both have to be accessed. We talked about power a few minutes ago, and the definition of power is that it is exactly what it says. It's having the ability to control. It's having the ability to get things done, and it's having the ability to sway action on behalf of an issue or concern. It's controlled by a few, and it requires a hook to gain influence. And so on the right, if you're a conservative, the people who control power in a community or in America tend to be corporations, tend to be the wealthy, tend to be lobbyists, tend to be donors. On the left, they tend to be groups like unions or activists who are able to wage power and to access it. And there are a number of tactics that we can use to do it. But as we want to make sure we have specifics, I did put a link in the chat for our benefit. There was an excellent advocacy guidebook that I want to present to you all that you can download. It's developed by a group called 50CAN, which is a progressive education reform organization that I think really lays out sort of very specific things to do, tangible things to do in your advocacy. Because of lack of time, I'm not going to go through it, but I do have the link for you all. I hope that you all will take a look at it and use it. And please feel free to ask questions afterwards. After this particular event today, I will make sure I put my email address in the link as well. But a few tactics that we can talk about that I think would benefit you are the following. If you have a particular issue, and I want to leave some time for people to give me real life examples so that we can drop right into it and answer those questions for you. I find that a little bit more an ability to maximize our time. It's not to hear me drone on, but to hear your real life activities and ideas or problems that you've had in terms of contracting and working with elected officials and how we can try to solve them in maybe 2 or 3 quick pieces of advice. So very quickly, I'm going to do 4 quick things. And one is looking at tactics. First is your crew. You have to have like-minded individuals that are committed to accomplishing a very specific goal. It doesn't have to be a big group. It doesn't have to be a large group of folks. If you look at the example of Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott, while history, if you ask people in Alabama how many people participated, probably in the thousands. When in actuality, it may have been 15 to 20 people who actually ran that entire movement of over a year of residents not getting on the bus and effectively ending Jim Crow segregation in the South. Doesn't take a lot. It takes a few folks who actually are committed to accomplishing a very specific goal. Remember the definition of advocacy that I gave earlier. There's no need for it to be large, just committed and knowing what you're talking about. That's key. When you engage with elected officials usually, even the best, kind-hearted, and most knowledgeable, do not have a deep knowledge about problems or particular issues, much less information about how to solve them. If you are trying to engage with elected officials to make change, you better know a lot more about the issue than they do. You better have your facts straight. You better know what legislation is existing, and you better know what you actually want them to do. As a former elected official, the worst thing I could have is a resident who would call and say, I need these potholes fixed. I don't care if there's no money in the budget. Okay, that doesn't help to solve the problem. Know the problem, know the issues surrounding why it may not have been addressed in the past, have a solution, and make sure that you can inform the elected official about it and give them ways that they can help you, or at least get them to make sure that they can actually join with you to find a solution together. You want to be encompassing and not adversarial, because they are there to help you. If they don't help you, that's another reason to become adversarial, but we'll get there next. Second thing I want to say is you want to grab the attention of the elected official and develop authentic relationships. You want to be able to have a meeting. That's always important. A formal meeting, an informal meeting, if it's a very controversial issue, social media engagement with the member, hitting up their email address, their social media, positive engagement. Please do never, when you come to an elected official, you should not be coming to them adversarially. It should be in the spirit of working together to solve a problem. It should be ways that we can try to help each other and those kinds of things. That's where you start off. You may go left, but that's why you have to come first and foremost. No elected official wants to meet with somebody who's coming in as a contrarian right out the gate. I don't like you, but I got to work with you. So here am I, solve my problem. Elected officials are human beings, just like everybody else. And they bleed when you cut them, and they have feelings, and they have ego as well. And so being mindful of that target before you walk in the door will get you more. Your mama always said, you get more with honey than you do with vinegar. And that remains true during your relationships and interactions with elected officials. If you can find ways to support them in the pursuit of your issue, do that. Provide research, provide information they may not see, provide alternative information. They are constantly getting something that is against what you're looking to do. Provide information, again, know the issue better and deeper and wider than they do before you walk in the door. So you look like the expert and they look like somebody who has to look at you and talk to you differently because you're the expert at bringing things that they don't know into their particular office, into their door. The third thing I would say is something called the responsible proposal and the respectful presentation. We'd like to term it the no blame problem solving. Again, if you have a responsible proposal, you've researched it, you have data to support it, you have nonpartisan data, not if you're a particular interest group, not their commission poll. Nonpartisan data is always the best because it doesn't pick sides. It is what it is and can stand on its own. Researched a solution, an alternative solution, a B plan or a C plan if the A plan doesn't work. If you present that kind of proposals to an elected official, you're likely to get a better response because there's nothing about gaming the system that is in their mind. You're not just coming at them in a political way. You're coming at them in a policy way because you want to get something done. And then it's the respectful presentation. I mentioned that not coming off as an adversary, right? Not coming off as somebody who wants to just blame. No blame problem solving means exactly that we are all in this together to solve a problem. The elected official and the constituent who is really your boss. But I'm your boss that's giving you the tools to be able to help me, help my interests, and help the community that I serve. It's very important to make sure that is. And that's sort of the inside strategy. If you meet an elected official that is just not working out with you, not engaging with you, not giving in to what you're trying to do and say, then we talk about an outside strategy, right? And that may be petitions, getting a large number of folks beyond your small organization or your small committed group, names and addresses on paper to make sure that they know that you have a groundswell of support for your particular issue. Politicians and elected officials, politicians and public servants, always respond to voters. And so the more names I see on a piece of paper of voters who can decide my fate and my future, the more serious I am going to take it, particularly if I'm in opposition to your situation and your issue. I voted for something called the Municipal Utilities Authority in the city of Newark, New Jersey once, and I had 3,000 names on the petition that told me that was a bad decision. I changed my vote. Because the residents in my ward told me to change my vote. And that is where my allegiance lied more than any other place, was with the voters. But it was a show of strength of registered voters in my district who came to me with an idea to say, you need to change your pace. But they also came with solutions about an alternative that I could embrace as I said no to what I initially voted for and embrace what they actually said. It needs to be continuous engagement. I think Dr. Wood mentioned that in his presentation, no one-offs. If you're going to be part of this, it has to be a consistent thing. It has to be something that goes on and on and on and on continuously and forward with no stopping. And I think that's important. The last thing I'll say is there are a lot of organizations out there, if we're talking about education, that can be resources to you that talk about education issues and the alternative sort of reform model, supporting Black boys specifically, going over and making sure that parents have power and know how to ask tough questions of their schools. Those kinds of resources I know are out there. There was some that came through with Dr. Wood. I'd like to throw a few out here myself. The National Parent Union, and while it's not specifically Black, it is a group, an organization, a national union of parents of students in all manner of public schools. I mentioned the 50 Can Advocacy Guide, which I put a link to that I think is a good guide for you. And then there's information that you can get when you say, well, how do I get access to some of these reports? And how do I know some of these things and what's out here in terms of the general grouping of education issues? Some of these things are debated on podcasts. And 2 podcasts that I listen to are 8 Black Hands, which are 4 African-American males who have been working in education, working to get more Black teachers in the pipeline of education, talking about self-determination of schooling in our communities. I invite you to look at them and to listen to them. And then there's AOS, which is another similar organization of Black men talking about education and Black boys specifically and the like. And so that's a few things that will help you, I think, look holistically at advocacy. But beyond that, I've talked enough. I love to hear from those that are here and to hear your questions, or maybe even a hypothetical or something that you're actually in and trying to reach out to elected officials and you're not getting any place, or you need to change tactics and you're looking for some advice. So with that, I will shut up. And if you could put your question in the chat, I'll be glad to answer them as we go forward. And I'm looking to see. Let's see here.
Is there a way to make this a regular meeting so you could the participants going to speak?
I'm assuming you can. I don't know if I can do it myself. But if people want to jump in, I mean, I just heard you, King. If anybody wants to ask a question, I'm willing to do that too. Yes, Lisa? Can you unmute yourself?
No, I think the way this is set up was the main, she can't.
She cannot. Right. And I can't.
Right. There's questions coming in through the Q&A as well as the chat.
Okay. So it's just the chat. Okay.
So I'll help out as well. If you don't mind.
Okay. I'm trying to see.
There's a question that asks from Karen Goins, as a white woman, how can I best support Black families and students?
Yes. So I guess I want to know a few more things. As a white, what was the question? As a white woman,
how can I best support Black families and students?
Essentially, it's listening to them. It's listening to parents, listening to students actually articulate what their needs are. There's a poll that shows that most Americans in the education sector listen and believe teachers more than any other entity in public education. And that's surprising to me because I would think people would listen more to parents in the sphere of education, because they're the ones who actually are sending their children to public schools and choosing to do so. And so I thought that was interesting. But what we hear constantly from parents, at least in the schools that I represent, are that parental voices need to be strengthened, need to be more organized. That's why I mentioned the National Parent Union that's out here trying to do that, give voice to parents as it speaks. But you need to listen to the voices, the hopes, the dreams, the fears, the aspirations of parents and their students in the classroom, telling you what they need and telling you what they want. Even in economically challenged communities where I think people feel these parents are uneducated and don't know what they want. And I would dare say that they are probably the parents who know best, even more than parents of who are wealthy, because the consequences and stakes of getting it wrong have a more detrimental effect on children who come from tougher neighborhoods and tougher situations than they are in terms of the outcomes from wealthier communities.
There's another question that says, what role do teacher unions play in promoting politicians to support Black students? Politician.
Yeah, I'm trying to, could you repeat that one more time? I'm trying to find it myself.
What role do teacher unions play in prompting politicians to support Black students?
Okay. Well, it depends on who you ask. The role of teachers unions in education has been, I think, something that has been a bone of contention and controversy. I think in the last 20 to 30 years, I think at one time teachers unions were seen as unassailable, and I think in recent years there's been problems with folks. I think mainly because as schools have not incrementally gotten better for the masses of Black and brown kids. People have said, we need more from teachers. We know it's not only on teachers, but that teachers have to do a little bit more. But teachers unions have an exorbitant effect. I mean, an oversized influence, if you will, with politicians of every stripe, of every party, because of the amount of money they give to campaigns and to lobbying efforts. And so their voice is a lot more outsized than, say, as I mentioned before, parents and students. But I think on the flip side, teachers unions do provide some real, again, specific things that they want politicians to do in terms of making their schools better. And I think in many instances that can be good for public education in general. But always remember, a union is always going to put the needs of its membership first before anything else. That doesn't mean that what's good for teachers unions and teachers in unions is not necessarily bad for public education, but know that if there is a choice to be made as to this particular thing or policy, the first consideration has to be what is best for the teacher and not necessarily for the school or for the student or for the family. And I think we need to understand that that's a transactional thing, and that's not a negative reflection on teachers. It's the reality of what unions actually represent, good and bad. Okay, looking here.
Should data for a specific district or committee that they have served on for your cause be provided ahead of the meeting with politicians?
Yes, so that's a very good question. Should data for the specific district or committee that they serve on for your cause be provided ahead of the meeting with the politicians? Absolutely. If you have relevant data and research that really spells out your concerns, providing that before a meeting just really makes you the expert when you walk in the room. It just makes a politician and or their staff just look at you as in a different way than just a resident or a constituent or a voter off the street who is just coming to engage, right? It makes you look like, wow, this person put the time in, or this group put the time in, put the effort in to get the information, that I would need to consider their cause, to consider their action, to consider their ask. And that's important, to have an ask, not just meet for the sake of meeting, but to have an ask. So yes, I would definitely give that data beforehand. And let me just say about the meetings, once you have a meeting with an elected official and he or she says, hey, that sounds good, we're going to consider that. Thank you for giving me all this data. Thank you for giving me your solution, your ideas, and we'll be hearing from you. You must always hold them on the line when you have them and say, thank you so much, elected official. When can I expect to hear back from you after this meeting? Get them to give you a specific date and time for when they will get back to you. Otherwise, it's just a nice photo op. It's just a nice meeting. So it's very important that you get a specific ask from them, and when they say thank you, you get a specific when can we come back to talk about your review of my data and to consider my ask as somebody who can actually make this happen. That's always important. That we always say the ask, and make sure you get you get them on the record to you specifically about when you can meet again to talk about what they are going to do, whether that support your issue or not support your issue. But we should have a resolution, Because if they're not going to support your issue, you can move on to another elected official. If they are going to support your issue, you should be talking about ways that they can do that in the future.
There was a question about, should you always start nice even when it's a critical issue? Should you go to a higher political level, the person above them?
I think the rule is always you start nice. I don't think there's a time when you don't start nice, even with somebody who's against your particular issue in public. I know a lot of politicians who will publicly face, and I hate to say it this way, but I'm bringing the curtain up a little bit, that will have a public facing on a particular issue or position that they have to take publicly. But if you meet with them behind closed doors and actually have a conversation with them, they will explain a little bit about why they take that position in a public facing and where there's wiggle room and where there's room for potential change or growth or more information to change their minds. So I always start nice. Even like I said, if they come out publicly against my particular issue, always work, remember they hold power, remember they're decision makers, and remember that typically those who have been there, a lot of times they have a longevity, which means it ain't going anywhere. And so you don't start off by starting off immediately sort of confrontational. You're going against an institution that may be there for a long time, that may have a lot of power amassed that can stop you where you are in terms of getting things done. And that's what we don't want. If we can't get them to support us or her to support us, we can move on. But you don't want to damage relationships and having that person say, I don't like that group. I don't like that individual. I don't care about their issue. They were nasty to me. They were confrontational and I can't work with them. That's what you don't want. You don't want a door permanently closed to you.
Brother Rice, can you pin Denise, the other interpreter, so that we can switch off? And then I think on time check, we are about 3 minutes from 2 hours in.
Okay. I can
Then you right click.
them.
Pin Denise.
Pin Denise. Okay. I'm going to.
There you go.
I'm looking at how I pin.
You did.
I did. Okay. I didn't do anything, but good, good going, Denise. Whatever you did, it worked. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I did put a link in there for the 50 can doc. I will put my my email in here as well. I apologize for not being able to go longer. This is a big discussion, and I would value hearing from people via email and looking forward to respond. Thank you for listening on a Sunday, as Dr. Woods mentioned earlier, and thank you for being a part of improving the outcomes and lives of Black boys and girls. We need advocates like you working every day for the good fight and deconstructing what the world thinks about our kids.
Thank you.
Thank you.